When I was asked to comment on a paper called The Power to Declare Peace, I was very excited because I think this is a much needed paper, and there's a huge amount in here, incomplete at this point, and I look forward to reading more. It has Michael Paulson's usual verve, confidence, and willingness to take ideas to their logical conclusions, and I appreciate all of that. And it also, much of it, I think, is quite sensible and follows from first principles of the executive power that I share. But I'm not going to talk about any of that because that would be points of agreement. One of the segments that is most fleshed out in the excerpt that Michael gave us is, by happy coincidence, one of the portions that I don't agree with. So let's talk about that. It'll be much more fun. And he, of course, alluded to this in his summary, and that is his theory that the president, by some combination of the executive power vested in the vesting clause of Article 2 and the commander-in-chief clause, has the right to end a war whenever he wants to, and including even at the beginning. That is to say, Congress could declare war, and he could just say, don't think I'm going to do it. I think that is a highly dubious proposition. I want to talk about why, but I also want to talk methodology along the way, because I find that Michael's arguments are surprisingly devoid of what I would ordinarily consider to be originalist evidence. There's not very much about how the words were used, what they meant prior to the Constitution. Commander-in-chief, for example, very rich word. They were very familiar with it. Don't see much about that. There's very little about the drafting history of the Constitution, and it's not because there wasn't a whole bunch going on at the convention about this. I mean, it is striking that as the executive power is first being debated in Philadelphia on July 2nd, 1787, the first substantive day of discussion of this, the very first thing that is said about the Virginia plan in this respect is, oh my goodness, this would give the president the powers of peace and war, which would make him a king. Peace and war is all over it. And then you have a cascade of folks speaking. So Rutledge says, well, I'm for a unitary executive, but not giving him the powers of peace and war. Wilson says, I'm for a powerful executive, but not giving him the powers of peace and war. And the powers of peace and war are voted down on 2 days later, never to return. And when Wilson and Rutledge are two of the 5 members of the Committee of Detail and dominate this, you've probably heard me before, the Committee of Detail, the most misnamed institution of the entire founding era since they wrote 2/3 of the Constitution. What do? They assign the power of war to Congress, and they assign the power of peace, that is to say the treaty power, which is what they thought of as the power of peace, to the Senate. Now later, disenchantment sets in with the Senate, and all of the Senate's special powers are reassigned to the president with advice and consent of the Senate. So it comes back to the president through the back door. But all of this seems to me to be rather significant information for a paper which is at an originalism conference, and the paper has the title, The Power to Declare Peace. So let's talk about the idea that the president can just simply refuse to execute a declaration of war. Michael principally argues that the president's power to do this comes from some combination of the executive power and the commander-in-chief power. There are hints that maybe the words declare war, that is the congressional power, might have something to do with it. That's where I would start. What does Congress's power to declare war include? Now, he and I are in complete agreement that the power to declare war includes the power to initiate war, and thus the president can't start a war on his own, even if he is a commander-in-chief. That's a point of agreement. But what else might it mean? Well, I think it's quite significant that, although not mentioned in the paper, that the first two wars that we were involved in both were started by virtue of congressional passage of authorizations to use force. This is the quasi-war with France and the war against the Barbary States. It isn't until the War of 1812 that there is a declaration of war. Now, I think the fact that the people who are carrying out this Constitution in its very first days, the fact that they think that Congress has this choice between authorizations and declarations, it might mean that there is, in fact, such that both are available, and there's a distinction. Well, what's the difference between an authorization and a declaration? Well, an authorization allows the president to take the country to war, but it doesn't oblige him to. It's an extremely flexible and usable, sensible instrument because it allows the president to go to the other country and threaten war and hope that they back down. That's the whole point of it. Most of our conflicts in American history, including the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, are authorizations rather than declarations. Well, what is a declaration of war? It can't be the same thing, and I can't prove what I'm about to say, but I think it's an extremely plausible description of every single declared war, and therefore maybe ought to be a candidate for a definition of the term in the Constitution, that a declaration of war is a decision by Congress to go to war until that war is successfully either ended by treaty or is successfully prosecuted all the way to the end. We've had 5 declarations of war in American history. All of them have been of that sort, although the 2 world wars of the 20th century did end in very peculiar ways, which I think Michael's description of that in the paper is extremely interesting, rich, and I hope everybody looks at it. But when Woodrow Wilson's Paris peace treaty the Treaty of Versailles gets rejected by the Senate, you have to end World War I in some other ways, and they sort of scramble and end up passing a statute ending the war. I think that's perfectly consistent with this story. So here's a thesis. The president can end that he doesn't have to go to war under authorizations, he does have to go to war under declarations, and that this is just like all other things in the Constitution. So it's just like the enforcement of statutes. Congress passes a statute saying something's illegal, the president has to enforce it. Now, of course, there's prosecutorial discretion, there are all kinds of bits of flexibility, just as the president can enter into ceasefires and doesn't have to be at war every day. Right, but basically, but the president cannot simply say, I don't like that statute, and I refuse to enforce it. That would be the dispensing power, and the way the take care clause, the reason the take care clause is worded as a duty rather than merely a power was precisely to eliminate the dispensing power. Well, Michael seems to think that we have a dispensing power for declarations of war. I don't see why that would be so. How about spending? For most of our history, presidents interpreted appropriations as being caps rather than commands. But when Nixon took that too far in the impoundment controversy, Congress passes a statute saying, no, from here on out, what we mean by an appropriation is you have to spend it. So now the president no longer has we didn't call it dispensing power, called it an impoundment power. It's the same thing. Michael seems to think that the president still has an impoundment power but not for spending for the declaration. I don't understand why that would be so. How about but maybe Congress, when it passes these declarations of war, maybe they're trumped by executive powers. So how about the executive power under the vesting clause? Michael and I share a lot of assumptions about what the executive power is that I think not everybody in the room agrees with, but that's not the ground of our difference. But I think the best reading of the executive power clause is that it is a residual power which is defeasible when Congress exercises its enumerated powers. Well, one of the enumerated powers is, of course, the power to declare war. I don't understand why that doesn't. I don't understand how the executive power to carry out Congress's instructions includes the power to violate them. And I might add that Hamilton and Madison both explicitly agree with this, my interpretation in the Pacificus Helvetius debates over the Washington's neutrality proclamation. When Madison and Hamilton both agree with something, I'm like a little bit hesitant to say that the other is true. As to the commander-in-chief power, I think Michael mainly argues through the fallacy of the excluded middle. He has an extended argument directed at Sai Prakash to the effect that, well, of course Congress can't, according to Mike, and I think he's quite right about this. He says, and maybe Sai may disagree, I think Sai does disagree. Of course Congress can't legislate all the way down to tactical decisions, that the commander-in-chief power is the power to conduct the war according to the president's own discretionary decisions. I agree with that, but I do not think it follows from that he can actually end the war altogether. I think it's just like prosecutorial discretion. That is to say, the president's job is to win the war if there's a declaration. Maybe that includes ceasefires, maybe that includes all kinds of things, but it doesn't include the power just to say to Congress, you've declared war, but no, I prefer not. Thank you.
In part, there's more work, more material to be added, but I'm actually going to be building on the president who would not be king. I think much of the originalist analysis that supports my reasoning comes from Michael McConnell, Michael Ramsey, Sai Prakash on certain points in terms of the allocations of the powers of peace and war. I think it is instructive that, and I think this is in the paper, how the Articles of Confederation assign the powers of peace and war, the power of directing troops and various things, and how the textual changes that were made in the drafting of the Constitution reflect that. The very omission of a specific allocation of peace power is what gives rise to thinking about the various powers that the various branches have to effectuate peace: the treaty power, the executive power over foreign affairs, and military power, commander-in-chief. I'm intrigued by this distinction between authorizations and war declarations, and I want to pursue that, but my instinctive reaction is I don't buy it. I think that the power to authorize the use of military force by an authorization flows from the declare war clause power. You don't need to say the word declare. You don't need to say the word war. But it is the declare war clause power that gives Congress the power to authorize the use of military force. So as interesting as that possible distinction is as a ground of what the president has to enforce and what he may enforce, I actually don't buy it. I think it's right that the most bold and reckless claim I make is that the president doesn't have to fight wars, right? But what this argument is that the commander-in-chief clause power gives the president essentially plenary control over the conduct of war, how to wage war. And at some point, and you can see this through many historical examples, the power to conduct war includes the power to decide when war is at an end and conclude an armistice, to decide when the objectives have been completely achieved, partially achieved, satisfactorily achieved. Oh, they're not achieved, we need to bug out. These are all functions of the commander-in-chief power to conclude terms of peace, either provisionally or permanently. George Washington decided against war. John Adams basically made peace in the Quasi-War. We are accustomed to thinking, and our intuitive response is that where Congress has authorized war, the president's got to fight to the finish, right? But it hasn't always been that case, and at some point, presidents always draw a line at where they stop. And if you think rigorously about what it is that authorizes that power, it is the Commander-in-Chief Clause power, and I'm just following it to its logical conclusion. I think it is true that in many instances the president will have a constitutional obligation to fight, and in good faith will have to fight and faithfully execute the war declaration, but I think it is within the Commander-in-Chief power. Now, I drop a footnote at some point to the expected problem of, how, if a war resolution is like any other statute, what gives the president the power to decline to execute statutes? And I think there are a couple of possibilities. One is that the commander-in-chief power is its own power. It might be distinctive and might have different principles attached to it. Whatever the scope of the commander-in-chief power, it is a limitation on the scope of Congress to compel war. So it could be there's something distinctive about the commander-in-chief clause power. Also, I am not sure that the executive power of law execution doesn't include some substantial measure of enforcement discretion. I think what I called, I'm trying to remember what I provisionally entitled that draft, but I am skeptical of the idea that the law execution power of the president forbids the president to decline to execute laws, even on policy grounds. That's a radical view we'll save for another day. Because Larry's given me the hook, we'll get to go to questions.